Okay. Hi, Epidemics, early birds, everybody who arrived on time today. So today is the last day of the semester. There will be another set of assignments posted this afternoon, and everything is due by Sunday, May 7th. Does anybody who is here need to do an in-person presentation?
Nope.
Okay, good. In that case, what I want to do a couple of things today. I'm going to start by kind of going through a semester review. So I tried to pick diseases that would be both interesting and representative of a broad spectrum of really important issues in epidemics, disease management, public health, and that sort of thing. So we talked about HIV/AIDS. This is an ongoing pandemic. It started, well, it's hard to get an exact date, but we became aware of it in 1981. And it has taken the lives of 42 million people since 1981. This is the fourth highest death toll for any disease since we've recorded history. And when we talk about these diseases that have had these major impacts, and when we talk about epidemics, we tend to focus on diseases that have a clear start point and preferably sometimes an end point. Diseases that have just been around forever, that have been going at a constant rate in the background, are generally just considered endemic, regardless of their death toll. And we talked about HIV specifically because it's a viral infection, because we have a lot of information on the history of it, and because it attacks the immune system. So this gave us a chance to look at the immune system and how that functions. We talked about smallpox, another virus. This one killed at least 500 million people in the last 100 years. So this one is really, really deadly, but we've eradicated it. We don't have to worry about smallpox anymore. We talked about the 1918 flu. This tends to get listed as number 2 on the list of deadliest pandemics. It probably wiped out 5% of the world population in a 2-year time period. Other flu pandemics have occurred, and other ones have had death tolls of over 1 million years. Flu pandemics, however, tend to only last 1 to 2 years. We talked about plague, which was our bacteria. We can generally handle a lot of bacterial diseases nowadays with antibiotics. Plague still exists, but nowadays it's really rare. And as I said, we can treat it. But the Black Death, that 5-year time period, may have killed up to half of the population worldwide, which is huge if you think about the population cutting in half in a 5-year period. Even though this happened way back in time when the population was much lower than it is now, we're still talking about up to 200 million people. This is definitely the deadliest pandemic that we are aware of in history. And again, plague has caused multiple epidemics, and they've all been really nasty. And we talked about malaria as our parasite. It's generally considered endemic. It's been around longer than there have been humans. Fortunately, it is in decline worldwide. There are lots of ways to prevent this, including mosquito control, window screens, bed nettings, and that sort of stuff. There were a couple of diseases we did not cover this semester that are still major diseases. We did not cover or talk about cholera. So cholera is a disease that is currently in pandemic state right now. There have been at least 6 pandemics of this. Generally, it kills high numbers of people. In modern times, these pandemics and outbreaks of cholera tend to only happen in more impoverished parts of the world. Improved sanitation, improved water quality really help to reduce the risk of cholera. If we were able to supply clean water to everybody on the planet, this is a disease that would basically disappear. We did not talk about this one, Pokolitsli. I have no idea how to pronounce that. I'm not sure anybody does. Pokolitsli, we don't know what caused this disease. It might have been a particularly severe form of salmonella, or it might have been a hemorrhagic fever. When we talk about hemorrhagic fevers, of course, we're talking Ebola. We know there were at least 12 outbreaks in the Americas, from as far north as Mexico and all the way down into South America. We know that these epidemics occurred within 1 to 2 years of a major drought. So there's clearly some environmental factors going on here. The best accounts come from Mexico after the Spanish conquered Mexico. 2 of these epidemics, the ones listed here, early after the European invasion, and then a few years later, killed between 1/3 and half of the population in Mexico. And again, these were relatively short-term diseases. So this is the population when the pandemic began in 1545, and here's where it ended. So a huge decline in population. Still, the information is scarce about these. We haven't seen anything that looks like it since the early 1700s, so we just don't know enough about it to talk about it. And then the one that I want to spend time talking about today, which is tuberculosis. I call this one the big miss, the one that we really missed. Tuberculosis, or TB, is actually on the rise. This is a disease that caused an estimated 1.6 million deaths in 2021. It is a bacterial infection, but antibiotic resistance for tuberculosis is dramatically increasing worldwide. And it is one of the big long-term killers of people, and it's the #2 contagious cause of death in the world right now, #2 after COVID. So COVID is currently worse than TB, but TB probably going to be lasting a lot longer than, well, we hope, than COVID. Okay, before we start getting into TB, I know a lot of you guys came in a little bit late. Does anybody need to do a live presentation today? All right, good. So let's talk about TB. I'm going to start with reading a quote from Charles Dickens in his book, Nicholas Nickleby, where he's describing tuberculosis. There is a dread disease which so prepares its victims, as it were, for death. A dread disease in which the struggle for soul and body is so gradual, quiet, solemn, and the result so sure that day by day, grain by grain, the mortal part wastes and withers away, so that the spirit grows light. A disease in which death and life are so strangely blended that death takes the glow and hue of life, and life the gaunt and grisly form of death. A disease which medicine never cured, wealth warded off, or poverty could boost exemption from, which sometimes moves in great strides, or sometimes at a tardy, sluggish pace, but slow or quick, it is ever sure and certain. Okay, so tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So the Mycobacterium, I knew there was a spelling error in there. The Mycobacterium genus of bacteria are a group of bacteria that they're aerobic bacteria, which means they have to have oxygen available. They are not able to move under their own pressure, under their own force. So we call that non-motile. They move along with whatever breeze or fluid they're in at the time. Most mycobacterium are not pathogenic. They're not harmful. And there are lots of different mycobacterium that cause tuberculosis-like symptoms. They tend to be specific for a specific type of organism or a specific species. So there's human tuberculosis, which can also infect other primates. There's a bovine tuberculosis, which can impact cattle and wild species related to cattle, like water buffalo. There's an avian tuberculosis, which can infect a wide range of different birds. So you get the idea what we're talking about here. Tuberculosis is transmitted largely by respiratory droplets. So somebody coughs or sneezes out, some of the bacterium goes in the air. These bacterium attach to very, very small particles with liquid or mucus or whatever, and they can stay suspended in the air for long periods of time, which allows them to spread. Somebody can have sneezed in a room, and an hour later, you could walk into the room and inhale the bacteria. So really long time periods. most exposures to tuberculosis go nowhere. Only about 10% of exposures result in disease or infection. These bacteria also reproduce really, really slowly. So when we talked about bacterial replication, you may recall, I'm pretty sure I said this, some strains of bacteria can double their population every 30 minutes. Tuberculosis, it's a much slower reproductive rate. These bacteria will divide once every 25 to 32 hours. So very, very slow reproductive rate. What tends to happen early in the infection is the immune system kills off some of the infected cells and forms this cyst-like structure. So between the immune system function and the bacteria, it creates this little pocket where the bacteria is still alive, but the pocket is surrounded by immune cells, white blood cells. So this can go on for long periods of time. Inside the cyst, the bacteria changes the pH. The food supply will dwindle, but TB just continues to divide. It just keeps doing its thing. Having this slow rate of reproduction means that it can survive on small amounts of food. And it can stay dormant for very long periods of time, generally until something happens and the host immune system weakens. So there's another infection, you get old, immune systems don't work as well. And this causes the immune cells around the infection to either just leave because they've got another infection to deal with, or they die off of old age. And this is where the disease starts. And this time period between exposures and active infection can be as little as 2 months, or it can be multiple years. In some cases, decades. So this is an X-ray, a chest X-ray of somebody with tuberculosis. So the spine kind of goes through the middle. This is the liver, the stomach here, the heart is here. These are the ribs, the clavicles, the bone right here. And these hazy areas are signs of tuberculosis infection. Lots of different infections look like this on an X-ray. I'm told that there are some characteristics to the X-ray that are relatively unique to TB, but I'm not an X-ray tech. I don't know what those are. Symptoms. Non-specific flu-like symptoms at the beginning. This seems to be the case for a lot of diseases. These flu-like symptoms are actually your immune system functioning. And we get fatigue, we get malaise, which is kind of like, yeah, I just don't feel like doing anything today. Weakness, unexplained and unexpected weight loss, and a cough. The disease progresses, you start having fevers, night sweats, that appetite, you'll lose your appetite. And the coughing gets worse. And eventually it changes to what is called purulent sputum. Ooh, big words. Basically, it means there's a lot of pus in the sneezing and the coughing. In TB, this is a sign that lung tissue has died. In movies and in books, you often know that somebody has TB because they cough delicately into a handkerchief and then pull the handkerchief away and there's blood. Certainly this does happen with TB, especially during later stages of the infection, but it doesn't happen in all patients. So it's not like that's a guarantee that that's going to happen. And these symptoms will last for months, and they will keep getting worse and worse as time goes by. Many people just, they push through it. They're going through their lives. They're like, man, this cold won't go away. Now, this is classic TB, which is the lung infection TB. But TB can also infect other places in the body, the brain, the bones, the kidneys. You get cyst-like structures there as well. You get loss of cells in those places as well. During this whole time period, during the active infection, the person who is infected is contagious. And the R naught for TB is between 10 and 15, which means that each infected person can infect between 10 and 15 other people. Remember, though, only about 10% of infected people go on to have disease. So they will give the disease on average to 1 to 1.5 people. This infection and this contagious time period can last for years. This is a very, very slow disease. Untreated, the case fatality rate is around 45%. People with HIV or other immune problems are at higher risk. Obviously, they're more likely to develop active TB if they're exposed, and the case fatality rate can be as high as 100%. So where did TB come from? TB came from a zoonotic disease in cattle. Cattle's a broader term that includes cows and similar species. We call this bovine TB. And bovine TB can also infect things like deer and elk and other what we call hoof stock, other wild animals that have hooves, basically, that eat a lot of grasses and vegetation. Just like in people, bovine TB is a slow progressing disease that may or may not cause symptoms. And the symptoms in cattle are very similar to what we see. Weight loss, depression, sluggishness, and loss of appetite. In the US, we have meat inspection systems that try and detect TB in meat or milk products. Raw milk can transmit TB. Uncooked meat can transmit TB, but cooking and pasteurization of milk kills off the bovine TB. So if you drink pasteurized milk and you cook your meat, you're fine. And the term pasteurization is a process named after Louis Pasteur. This is a process that involves heating liquids at moderately low temperatures like just at the boiling point for short periods of time. So you're not cooking the product, but you're heating it up to kill infectious organisms. TB can still be caught from exposure to infected cattle. You're going to notice a lot of the images in this topic are coming from India, and that's because the book I've been reading about TB was written by Vidya Krishnan, a female journalist who is talking a lot about TB in India, because that is one of the current hot spots of tuberculosis in the world. We have signs of tuberculosis that we can find on ancient human remains, because TB, if it infects the bone, it forms these characteristic, it looks almost like an ice cream scoop went in and took out a scoop of bone. This is a bone infection of TB. And we see signs of this in Egyptian mummies from at least 3,700 years before the Common Era, BC. So that's 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. We found it in multiple thousand-year-old mummies from India and China, and a 3,000-year-old mummy from Peru. So we know that TB was widespread worldwide by at least 3,000 years ago. The mummy from Peru is very interesting because it shows that TB might have been in humans at the time period when humans first migrated to the Americas, which we don't have a specific date on that, but it could have been between 15 and 20,000 years ago. Or bovine TB could have existed in wildlife in the Americas. It could have crossed from them into humans in the Americas, just like it did in the old world. We can't tell the difference between human TB or bovine TB that's infecting a human from the skeletons. So TB peaked in the late 1800s and then went on a decline through the 1900s. In London, before 1730, around 15% of deaths were due to tuberculosis. By 1900, that percentage had doubled. It went from 15% of all deaths to 30% of all deaths in less than 200 years. Why did this happen? Very simply, the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is a time period where we started moving from a largely agrarian or farm-based cultures where most people were farmers, and we started having jobs in cities. We started making complex things like steam train engines and weaving cotton into clothing and all kinds of stuff like this. And during this period, there were more jobs available in cities. And so a lot of people would move from the countries, from the farmlands, into the cities, creating a population boom in those cities. And this population boom was so significant that housing was not able to keep up with the expanding population. So in some major cities like London, you would, instead of having your own place to live, you would rent space, and you would rent space to store your stuff, and you would rent a bed. And you would have rights to that bed for 8 or 9 hours a day. And when your time was up, you had to leave. And the next person would come in and it would be their turn for the bed, without changing the sheets in between. So you've got multiple people, generally three people a day would share a bed at different times. TB was still a leading cause of death until the 1940s, when we started having success with antibiotics. And that caused a decline until about the turn of the century. So right around the year 2000, we started to see an increase in tuberculosis again. TB is also known as consumption or scrofula. So if you hear these words in movies or read them in books or something, we're talking about the same disease. It is associated with poetic and artistic qualities. So it's sometimes also called the romantic disease. And again, if you watch a lot of older movies or read older books, you'll often see the heroine wasting slowly away, still beautiful, thin and pale. It's been portrayed in a great many stories and movies and paintings over the century. Many famous artists either had tuberculosis or were close to people with tuberculosis. So Edgar Allan Poe, Franz Kafka. Kafka wrote Metamorphosis about somebody turning into a cockroach. You may have had to read that in school at some point. The Bronte family, basically they all had tuberculosis. Chopin, Charles Dickens, of course, George Orwell, Jane Austen, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was married to Lyndon B. Johnson. No, wait, why did I say Lyndon B. Johnson? Roosevelt, not Teddy Roosevelt, the other one. Anyway, she died from tuberculosis. Vivian Leigh, who played Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, Henry David Thoreau. So lots and lots of famous people either had it and died from it or knew somebody who died from it. So not surprisingly, over time, treatments before the age of antibiotics, they really did not do a lot to help people. A lot of treatments would be things like bleeding, cupping, which is heating a glass dome and putting it on somebody's back. It's supposed to suck things out as it cools down, but it doesn't do anything. But even with antibiotics, TB is tricky. It has an unusual cell wall. So antibiotics that target the cell wall generally don't work against this one. And antibiotics that have to get into the cell may not work against tuberculosis. Depending on the strain, because it is a slow divider that can form these cysts that protect it from the immune system, treatment, even today, can last between 6 months to 2 years, often multiple different antibiotics. Now, I don't know about you, but taking antibiotics for 2 years, that's rough. So, no surprise, we get very low compliance. People quit taking their antibiotics. And hopefully we all know by now that that leads to antibiotic resistance. Okay. So we're going to talk about the rise of antibiotic resistance specifically in Mumbai, India. So this is one of, I said India is a hotspot for tuberculosis. Parts of Mumbai are a hotspot within India. And it's what the author of the book I'm reading really focused on. So Mumbai is on the coast, and it was occupied by the British East India Company, which was trading in a lot of spices and teas and really controlled a lot of the world in both the Pacific and the Caribbean, and of course in India. And it transformed the city. It also renamed it Bombay. And it transformed it into an urban manufacturing center. So rapid urbanization, which brings in immigrants and epidemics. And because this was colonialism at work, there was a high concentration of poverty in Mumbai. And the way they tried to house people were by constructing these tall buildings. This looks like it's probably as much as 10 stories. It's hard to see where the bottom is. And these are poorly constructed. And in general, they are very, very close together. So you can see this building is not that far away from this one. This is kind of typical construction for housing the poor. And generally, when we talk about this kind of housing, we call it slums. It's not unusual to have large numbers of people in relatively small apartments in these conditions. And what we end up with is low airflow, especially in the low levels of the building. The buildings are generally incredibly close together, so you don't get a lot of circulation of air at the ground level. Crowded conditions, and these buildings become incubators for a TB epidemic. For people on the higher floors, they have more airflow, more sunlight. They're at lower risk for TB. Impoverished people worldwide have limited access to healthcare. One particular building in Mumbai was such a hot spot that at least one person in each apartment not only had TB, but had drug-resistant, antibiotic-resistant TB. And so when we talk about antibiotic resistance, we start with drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is resistant to one antibiotic. And then we go to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, which is resistant to 2 to 3 antibiotics, and extremely drug resistant TB, which is 4 resistant to 4 or more antibiotics. The extreme drug-resistant TB is the one that generally requires 2 years of treatment to cure. In 2019, India accounted for 31% of worldwide deaths for tuberculosis. And they have the most drug-resistant cases at any of these levels. So we know these buildings are a problem. Studies have been done that show these buildings are a problem. So the government of Mumbai said, okay, we're going to rehabilitate the slums. Yeah. I think we all know how these sorts of projects go. No surprise, they never really work that well. Nobody wants to invest money in poor people. So the structures that resulted have been described as singularly hideous and have a lot of the same problems that the earlier slums did. And now they also include things like malfunctioning plumbing, malfunctioning electrical systems, all kinds of things like that. So why is this a problem specifically in India? Well, it's not just India, but why is this one of the hot spots, and why is it a hot spot in Mumbai? So one of the issues and problems in India is something called the caste system. And you are born into a specific caste. What caste you are born into determines your socioeconomic options. If you're born a Brahmin, you can become a priest or a teacher, and you're going to have high income rates, access to resources, the ability to own property, opportunities. The lower the caste, the less resources there are. The Dalits, also called the outcasts, that's where that word comes from, are people who do things like clean streets, clean latrines, collect garbage. So these are low-paying, pretty much manual labor jobs. And you don't have the opportunity to move up. So we're seeing with TB, especially in the lower caste, especially in the Dalits caste, poverty, crowding, malnutrition, poor access to quality healthcare. We're seeing the same problems over and over and over again as the source of an infection, as the source of an epidemic. Now, one of the things that makes TB different is, of course, how hard it is to treat, but it's also the difficulty in compliance. People don't want to take these medications as long as they are needed to take. So the World Health Organization came up with this concept called DOTS, direct observation I forget what the TS stands for. I don't have it here in my notes. But basically, this is a healthcare worker observing patients taking their pills on a daily basis. No surprise, if you have to go somewhere every day, 7 days a week, for 6 months to 2 years, and take a handful of pills in front of somebody, you're going to quit showing up. In the US, at times in the past, we have had nurses go to people's houses to try and observe. It never really works very well. When we're talking about drug-resistant strains of TB, especially multi-drug resistant and extreme drug resistance, people can take up to 20 pills every day. And the side effects of these medications can be just as severe as the side effects from chemotherapy for cancer. So you're not going to feel very well. You're going to have, since these are antibiotics, you're probably going to have lots of problems with diarrhea, digestive disorders, fatigue from the drugs as well as from the TB. You're not going to feel well. You're not going to be able to keep down a steady job. That's not going to work. So this is a current world map of tuberculosis based on number of cases per population size. So this is not saying this country has more individual cases, but compared to the population of that country, it has more cases. During COVID, masking and isolation reduced the number of COVID cases. I'm sorry, the TB cases. It did reduce COVID cases, but it also reduced new tuberculosis cases. Of course, we're not sticking with masking. We're not sticking with isolation. We can't stick with isolation forever. We're a social species, and cases are rising again, especially drug-resistant cases. So, where do we see the most cases? Here's India, Pakistan, Thailand, Sub-Saharan Africa, places where there's a lot of poverty, where people are malnourished, they're not getting enough calories. Some places in Indonesia, and as I mentioned through here, North Korea, right there, that's a real hot spot. And despite the fact that it is limited as to where it is, we're still losing 1 million people to 1.5 million people every year to this disease. Okay, that was the quick overview of tuberculosis. I did want to bring it up because it's on the rise, and it's probably something we will hear more about in the future. Hopefully, it will continue to be low where we're living, but you know, given the conditions, the economic conditions in the US, if we don't pull ourselves up and improve the economic conditions for our lowest, below the poverty level people, it could start to get established here as well. Any questions on tuberculosis?
So I've heard that it can also affect other parts of your body as well, like your spine. I heard that there's like a association between TB and like spinal damage or something like nerve damage.
Yes, absolutely. It can infect bone, which can cause damage to that bone. It can involve It can get into the central nervous system, which would be the spinal cord and the brain, and infect those areas. Anytime you've got a cyst forming in your nervous system, you're going to have damage. You're going to lose abilities, ranging from, partial paralysis, neuropathy, which is nerve pain, which can be very, very, very painful. Losing, if it's in the brain, depending on where the brain is, you can lose anything from vision, hearing, speaking, being able to concentrate and make decisions, all kinds of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions on this or on anything related to epidemics? This is our last class, and you have me for about 20 more minutes if you want to ask questions.
So is there no class on Thursday?
There is no class on Thursday. Okay, so what's going to happen? I'm going to post an assignment this afternoon, which will be the last assignment for this class. That will be due on Sunday before midnight. And that's it. That's the end of the semester.
So this is basically our last class, correct?
Yes, this is the last class.
Okay. And for the projects, we don't have to present them? Or is that like up to us?
It's up to you.
Okay.
If you wrote a paper, you do not have to present it.
Oh, okay, that's what I did. Okay.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed some of this class.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice summer. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
everything.
Yeah, thank you. I thoroughly liked the class very, very much.
Good. Glad to hear
Thank you
it.
so much. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.